Our
Have you ever
intelligence
witnessed a
confirms the
moment
enemy's
where a single
position.
sentence completely
We
changed
strike
the
at dawn.
atmosphere of a room?
Prepare for deployment.
Where years
Our
of experience,
intelligence confirms
wisdom,
the enemy's
and
position.
quiet dignity spoke
We
louder than
strike
the
at
loudest
dawn.
boasts of authority?
Prepare for deployment.
Sometimes the most powerful responses come not from those who shout the loudest, but from those who have earned the right to speak softly and still command absolute attention. In the world of military leadership, respect is earned through action, not just rank. And, sometimes, the most devastating responses come wrapped in calm, measured words that cut deeper than any angry retort ever could. This is the story of such a moment when a decorated Marine general's boastful claims met their match in the form of one quietly spoken reply that would echo through military circles for years to come. What you're about to read isn't just another military anecdote. It's a masterclass in leadership, humility, and the kind of quiet strength that can silence a room full of decorated officers with nothing more than the truth, delivered with surgical precision. This is the story of how sometimes, the most powerful weapon in any arsenal is simply knowing when to speak and what to say when you do. The Pentagon's corridors buzzed with the usual mixture of tension and purpose that characterized America's military headquarters on any given Thursday morning. Officers moved with practiced efficiency between meetings, their polished shoes clicking against the marble floors in rhythms that spoke of decades of discipline and service. But today was different. Today, the monthly Inter-Service Leadership Conference was taking place, bringing together some of the most decorated and experienced military minds in the country. The conference room on the third floor had been arranged with meticulous care. A massive oval table dominated the space, surrounded by leather chairs that would soon hold generals, admirals, and senior officials from every branch of the military. The walls were lined with portraits of legendary military leaders, faces that had guided America through its most challenging moments, their eyes seeming to watch over the proceedings with silent authority. As the morning wore on, officers began filing into the room. Each carried themselves with the bearing that comes from years of command, their chests adorned with ribbons that told stories of service, sacrifice, and achievement. Among them was General Marcus Hartwell, a Marine Corps officer whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. Hartwell was an imposing figure, standing well over 6 feet tall with shoulders that seemed carved from granite. At 55, his hair had turned distinguished silver at the temples, but his posture remained ramrod straight, and his eyes held the intense focus of a man who had spent 3 decades making life and death decisions. His uniform was immaculate, pressed to perfection, and his chest displayed an impressive array of decorations that spoke to a career filled with achievement and recognition. The general had earned his stars through a combination of tactical brilliance, political savvy, and an undeniable charisma that made him a favorite among Pentagon leadership. He had commanded troops in 3 different combat zones, earned a Silver Star for valor, and had been instrumental in developing several key strategic initiatives that had shaped modern military doctrine. His opinions carried weight in the highest circles of government, and his voice was often sought when major military decisions needed to be made. But Marcus Hartwell had one characteristic that sometimes overshadowed his considerable accomplishments: he loved to be the center of attention. Whether in formal briefings or casual conversations, the general had a tendency to steer discussions toward his own experiences and achievements. It wasn't necessarily malicious, but it was noticeable. He was the kind of man who could turn any story into one about himself, any lesson into an example of his own wisdom, any challenge into an opportunity to recount his own triumphs. As officers settled into their seats, the familiar pre-meeting chatter filled the room. Coffee cups clinked against saucers, papers rustled as agendas were reviewed, and quiet conversations buzzed about current operations, budget concerns, and personnel matters. The atmosphere was professional but relaxed. These were people who had worked together for years, who understood each other's strengths and quirks, who could communicate volumes with a glance or a subtle gesture. The conference was scheduled to cover routine matters: budget allocations for the upcoming fiscal year, personnel rotations, equipment updates, and strategic planning initiatives. Nothing particularly controversial was on the agenda, which perhaps made what happened next all the more surprising. General Hartwell had positioned himself at the table in a way that commanded attention. He had arrived early, choosing a seat that gave him a clear view of the entire room and ensuring that when he spoke, every eye would naturally turn his direction. As conversation swirled around him, he found himself increasingly drawn into a discussion about leadership challenges in modern military operations. The conversation had started innocuously enough. Admiral Sarah Chen, a Navy officer known for her innovative approaches to maritime strategy, had mentioned some of the difficulties her junior officers were facing in adapting to new technologies and changing tactical requirements. She spoke thoughtfully about the balance between traditional military values and the need for adaptation in an evolving global landscape. Colonel James Rodriguez from the Army had chimed in with his own observations about leadership development, sharing insights from his recent assignment overseeing a major training facility. His comments were measured and thoughtful, reflecting years of experience in developing young officers into capable leaders. It was then that General Hartwell decided to make his contribution to the conversation. As was his habit, he leaned back slightly in his chair, a gesture that seemed to signal to the room that something significant was about to be said. The conversations around him gradually quieted as attention turned his way, exactly as he had intended. "You know," Hartwell began, his voice carrying the confident tone that had served him well in countless briefings and public appearances, "leadership isn't something you can teach from a book or learn in a classroom. It's something you're born with, something that gets forged in the fire of real combat." He paused, letting his words settle over the room like smoke from a carefully lit cigar. Several officers nodded politely, though a few exchanged subtle glances that suggested they knew what was coming next. "I've been thinking about this a lot lately," the general continued, warming to his theme. "I've served in more combat zones than most people in this room. 3 major deployments, each one presenting unique challenges that required real leadership under pressure. Not the kind of leadership you practice in war games or simulate in training exercises, but the real thing. The kind where your decisions determine whether your people go home to their families or come back in flag-draped coffins." The room had grown noticeably quieter. While such direct language wasn't unusual in military circles, there was something in Hartwell's tone that suggested this wasn't going to be a brief anecdote. He was settling in for what promised to be a lengthy discourse on his own experiences and insights. "In Afghanistan," he continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone telling a familiar story, "I commanded a forward operating base in one of the most dangerous provinces in the country. Taliban activity was constant, supply lines were under threat daily, and morale was being tested in ways that would break civilian organizations. But that's where real leaders are made." Admiral Chen shifted slightly in her seat, her expression remaining diplomatically neutral. She had heard variations of this speech before, as had most of the people in the room. General Hartwell's war stories were well known, and, while his service record was undeniably impressive, his tendency to dominate conversations with tales of his own heroism had become something of a running joke among his peers. "The thing about combat leadership," Hartwell pressed on, clearly enjoying the attention, "is that it strips away all the pretense, all the theoretical knowledge, all the academic understanding of command principles. When bullets are flying and your people are looking to you for answers, that's when you discover what kind of leader you really are. And I'm proud to say that in every situation I faced, my troops knew they could count on me to make the hard decisions." He gestured broadly with his hands, a theatrical touch that emphasized his points. "I remember one particular operation, this was during my second deployment, where we had intelligence about a high-value target hiding in a compound about 15 clicks from our position. The operation required perfect timing, absolute precision, and the kind of leadership that can hold a unit together when everything goes wrong." Colonel Rodriguez glanced at his watch discreetly, wondering how long this particular story would take. He had heard versions of it before, though details seemed to change slightly with each telling. The compound got more heavily fortified, the intelligence became more time-critical, and the general's role became more central to the mission's success. "The thing is," Hartwell continued, his voice rising slightly with enthusiasm, "anybody can lead when things are going smoothly. It's when you're facing impossible odds, when conventional wisdom says the mission can't be accomplished, when your superiors are second-guessing your decisions from the safety of their headquarters, that's when real leaders step up." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning the faces around the table. "That operation was successful because I was willing to make the tough calls that other commanders might have hesitated to make. My men trusted me because they knew I had earned my rank through action, not through politics or paperwork or playing it safe." The general's voice had taken on a tone that suggested he was building to a particular point. "The problem I see too often in today's military is that we're promoting people who look good on paper but who have never been tested in real combat situations. They can quote doctrine chapter and verse, they can create impressive PowerPoint presentations, they can navigate Pentagon politics with the best of them, but when it comes to actual leadership under fire, well, that's a different story entirely. Several officers in the room began to sense that Hartwell's comments were moving beyond general observations about military leadership and were starting to feel more personal. His words seemed to carry an implication that those who hadn't seen combat in the same way he had were somehow less qualified to hold positions of authority. "I'm not saying that everyone needs to have my specific experiences," he continued, though his tone suggested otherwise, "but there's something to be said for leaders who have proven themselves in actual combat situations. When you've been responsible for the lives of hundreds of troops in hostile territory, when you've had to make split-second decisions that determine whether missions succeed or fail, when you've earned the respect of your people through action rather than just rank, that changes you. It makes you a different kind of leader." The room had grown increasingly uncomfortable. While military culture certainly valued combat experience, Hartwell's comments were starting to sound less like general observations about leadership and more like personal boasts disguised as professional insights. His tone carried an undertone of superiority that suggested he viewed his own experiences as somehow more valuable or meaningful than those of his colleagues. "The truth is," General Hartwell said, his voice taking on an even more confident tone, "not everyone in uniform has what it takes to be a real combat leader. It's not a criticism, it's just reality. Some people are better suited for support roles, administrative positions, or staff work. But when you need someone who can actually lead troops in battle, who can make the hard decisions under pressure, who can earn the kind of respect that makes soldiers follow you into impossible situations, well, that's a much smaller group of people." As he spoke, his chest seemed to puff out slightly, and his hand unconsciously moved to touch the silver star ribbon on his uniform. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable to the trained eyes of the military officers around the table. He was reminding everyone present of his decorations, his achievements, his position in what he clearly viewed as a hierarchy of military leadership based on combat experience. "I've had the privilege of serving alongside some truly exceptional leaders," he continued, though his tone suggested that he viewed himself as the primary example of such excellence. "Men and women who understood that leadership isn't about issuing orders from a safe distance, but about being where the action is, making the decisions that matter, and taking responsibility for the outcomes." The general paused, seeming to gather his thoughts for what promised to be the climax of his soliloquy. Around the table, his colleagues maintained expressions of polite attention, though several were beginning to show signs of impatience with his lengthy self-aggrandizement. The meeting agenda remained largely untouched, and the morning was wearing on. But Marcus Hartwell was clearly nowhere near finished with his impromptu lecture on combat leadership and personal achievement. If anything, he seemed to be gaining momentum, his confidence growing with each word, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from someone completely convinced of his own importance and expertise. What none of them could have anticipated was that his words were about to meet their match in the form of a response that would completely change the dynamic of the room and provide a lesson in humility that the general would never forget. As General Hartwell continued his discourse on combat leadership and personal heroism, most of the attention in the room remained focused on him. His commanding presence and confident delivery had a way of drawing eyes and holding attention, even when his audience was growing weary of his self-congratulatory narrative. But if anyone had taken the time to look around the table more carefully, they might have noticed that not everyone was hanging on his every word. Seated toward the far end of the conference table, in a position that seemed almost deliberately inconspicuous, sat a figure who appeared to be listening intently but saying nothing at all. Colonel William Bill Morrison occupied his chair with the same quiet dignity that characterized everything about his approach to military service. At 62, he was one of the senior-most officers in the room, though he carried his age and experience without fanfare or ostentation. Morrison was not a large man in the physical sense. He stood perhaps 5'9" tall, with a lean frame that spoke of a lifetime of physical fitness maintained through discipline rather than vanity. His hair had gone completely white years ago, and his face bore the kind of weathered appearance that comes from decades of service in harsh environments around the world. But it was his eyes that truly set him apart, clear, intelligent, and holding a depth of experience that seemed to measure everything and everyone around him with careful precision. His uniform was impeccable but understated. While General Hartwell's chest displayed his decorations like a billboard advertising his achievements, Morrison's ribbons were arranged with quiet precision, each one earned through service that he had never felt the need to trumpet publicly. To a trained eye, however, the collection was extraordinary. Combat ribbons from multiple theaters, service awards spanning 5 decades, and several decorations that spoke to the kind of classified operations that were never discussed in public forums. Colonel Morrison had built his career on a foundation of quiet competence and unwavering reliability. He was the kind of officer that commanders turned to when missions required absolute discretion, perfect execution, and leadership that inspired confidence without drama. His personnel files contain commendations from generals and admirals across all service branches, but he had never sought the spotlight, never campaigned for high-profile assignments, and never used his considerable achievements as stepping stones to personal glory. As Hartwell's voice continued to fill the conference room, Morrison's expression remained neutral, but those who knew him well might have detected the slightest tightening around his eyes. He had served with many officers like the general over the years, capable leaders whose effectiveness was sometimes diminished by their need for recognition and their tendency to measure their worth through comparison with others. Morrison had been in the Army for 44 years, having enlisted as a private straight out of high school in a small farming community in Iowa. His path through the ranks had been steady but unremarkable in the conventional sense. He had earned his commission through officer candidate school rather than West Point, had built his reputation through performance rather than connections, and had advanced based on the kind of quiet leadership that inspired loyalty without demanding attention. His first deployment had been to Vietnam, where he had served as a young lieutenant in an infantry unit operating in some of the war's most challenging terrain. Unlike many officers who had served in that conflict, Morrison rarely spoke about his experiences there. Those who had access to his service records knew that he had earned a Silver Star, a Bronze Star with V device, and a Purple Heart during his tour, but he had never used these decorations as conversation pieces or examples of his leadership philosophy. After Vietnam, Morrison had continued to serve in increasingly responsible positions, always seeming to find himself assigned to the military's most challenging missions and most difficult postings. He had served in Central America during the 1980s, in the Middle East during the Gulf War, and in Africa during several humanitarian operations that had required the kind of diplomatic sensitivity and operational expertise that made him invaluable to commanders who needed problems solved quietly and efficiently. Throughout his career, Morrison had developed a reputation as someone who could be trusted with the most sensitive assignments. He was the kind of officer that generals called when they needed someone who could work with foreign military leaders, coordinate complex multinational operations, or handle situations that required both military expertise and cultural sensitivity. His personnel files contained letters of commendation from heads of state, foreign military commanders, and CIA station chiefs who had worked with him on operations that would never be acknowledged publicly. But, perhaps most remarkably, Bill Morrison had managed to serve for more than 4 decades without ever seeking credit for his contributions or using his experiences as material for self-promotion. He was widely respected throughout the military community, but his reputation was built on the kind of quiet professionalism that earned respect through action rather than words. As General Hartwell continued his lengthy exposition on combat leadership, Morrison found himself thinking about the nature of true military service and the qualities that actually defined effective leadership. He had served alongside many officers over the years, had observed leadership under every conceivable circumstance, and had developed his own understanding of what separated truly exceptional leaders from those who merely held positions of authority. In Morrison's experience, the best leaders were often those who spoke the least about their own achievements. They were the officers who focused on their people rather than themselves, who measured success by the accomplishments of their units rather than their personal recognition, and who understood that true leadership was about service rather than glory. He had known many combat heroes over the years, and the ones who had impressed him most were invariably those who were most reluctant to discuss their own actions. They understood that heroism was something that others recognized rather than something you claimed for yourself, and that the most profound acts of leadership often occurred in moments when no one was watching or keeping score. Morrison's own approach to leadership had been shaped by these observations and by his own experiences in situations where the only thing that mattered was getting the job done and bringing his people home safely. He had learned that effective leadership was less about inspiring others through speeches about your own greatness and more about demonstrating through consistent action that you could be trusted to make sound decisions under pressure. As he listened to Hartwell's increasingly grandiose claims about combat leadership and personal heroism, Morrison couldn't help but think about some of the truly exceptional leaders he had known over the years. There was the sergeant major in Vietnam who had saved Morrison's life during an ambush and had never mentioned it again. There was the colonel in Central America who had prevented an international incident through quiet diplomacy and had never received public recognition for his efforts. There was the general officer who had made a decision that saved hundreds of lives and had never spoken about it outside of classified briefings. These were the leaders who had shaped Morrison's understanding of what military service really meant. They were people who understood that the measure of a leader was not found in the stories they told about themselves, but in the trust they earned from the people they served with and the results they achieved through quiet competence and unwavering dedication. Morrison shifted slightly in his chair, his attention returning to the present moment as Hartwell's voice continued to dominate the room. The general was now deep into what appeared to be a detailed account of a particular operation, complete with tactical details that seemed to grow more impressive with each telling. Several other officers around the table were beginning to show signs of impatience, glancing at their watches or shuffling papers in ways that suggested they were eager to move on to the actual business of the meeting. But Morrison remained perfectly still, his expression unchanging, his attention focused with the kind of discipline that came from decades of listening to briefings, absorbing information, and maintaining professionalism even in circumstances that tested patience. He had learned long ago that sometimes the most important thing a leader could do was simply listen, not just to the words being spoken, but to the underlying messages, the assumptions being made, and the dynamics being created by someone's need to be the center of attention. As he watched Hartwell gesticulate and pontificate, Morrison found himself thinking about a conversation he had once had with a general officer who had become something of a mentor to him early in his career. The general had told him that true leadership was like gravity, it was most powerful when it was invisible, when it worked not through force or display but through the quiet influence that came from competence, character, and genuine concern for others. That conversation had taken place more than 30 years ago, but Morrison still remembered it clearly because it had articulated something he had observed but had never been able to put into words. The most effective leaders he had known were not necessarily the ones who commanded attention through dramatic gestures or inspirational speeches, but rather those who earned respect through consistent performance and genuine care for the people they led. Morrison had tried to embody that kind of leadership throughout his own career, focusing on doing his job well rather than making sure everyone knew how well he was doing it. He had earned the respect of his peers and subordinates not through self-promotion but through the kind of reliable competence that made others trust his judgment and value his contributions. As General Hartwell's monologue continued, apparently building toward some kind of climactic point about the nature of combat leadership, Morrison remained silent and observant. He had no intention of interrupting or challenging the general's narrative. Such behavior would have been inconsistent with both military courtesy and his own personal style. But he was listening carefully, not just to what was being said but to what was being implied, and he was forming his own conclusions about the kind of leader who felt the need to spend so much time convincing others of his own greatness. Morrison had learned over the years that sometimes the most powerful response to grandiosity was simply silence, the kind of quiet presence that allowed others to reveal themselves completely while maintaining your own dignity and perspective. He had no need to compete with Hartwell's dramatic storytelling or to offer his own war stories as counterpoint to the general's narrative. But, as the minutes ticked by and Hartwell's claims became increasingly bold, Morrison found himself thinking that perhaps there were moments when silence was not enough, when someone needed to speak a different kind of truth, when the balance of a conversation required the kind of gentle correction that could only come from someone with nothing to prove and no need for recognition. He continued to listen and wait, his expression unchanged, his attention focused, his decades of experience providing him with the perspective to understand exactly what he was hearing and the wisdom to know when and how to respond. General Hartwell's voice had taken on an almost theatrical quality as his narrative reached what appeared to be its crescendo. The conference room, which had started the morning filled with the collegial atmosphere typical of senior military gatherings, had transformed into something resembling a one-man performance venue, with the general as both star and audience for his own dramatic presentation. "The mission I'm about to describe," Hartwell announced, his voice dropping to a more serious tone that demanded attention, "exemplifies everything I've been talking about regarding combat leadership under impossible circumstances." He paused dramatically, his eyes scanning the faces around the table to ensure he had everyone's complete attention. This was during my final deployment to Afghanistan, when I was commanding Forward Operating Base Phoenix in Helmand Province. We had received intelligence about a Taliban commander who was coordinating attacks against coalition forces throughout the region. This wasn't just any low-level operative, this was someone whose capture could significantly disrupt enemy operations across multiple provinces. The general leaned forward, his hands gesturing as he painted the tactical picture. The intelligence was time-sensitive. We had maybe a 12-hour window before this high-value target would move to a new location where we might not have another opportunity to capture him. The problem was that the compound where he was hiding was located in one of the most dangerous areas of our operational sector, surrounded by known IED fields and overlooked by positions that the Taliban had been using to launch attacks against our patrols. Admiral Chen found herself wondering why this particular story felt necessary to the conversation about leadership development, but she maintained her professional expression and continued listening. Around the table, other officers were doing the same, caught between military courtesy and growing impatience with what had become an extended exercise in self-promotion. My staff presented me with 3 different courses of action, Hartwell continued, his voice gaining intensity. The first was to call in an airstrike and level the entire compound. It would have eliminated the target, but intelligence indicated there were civilian families in the surrounding buildings, and I wasn't about to authorize an action that would result in innocent casualties. Colonel Rodriguez nodded slightly, appreciating at least that the general was acknowledging concern for civilian welfare, even if the story seemed designed primarily to showcase his own decision-making process. The second option was to request additional support from higher headquarters, more troops, more air cover, more time to develop a safer approach. But that would have meant losing our window of opportunity, and I knew that this target wouldn't be sitting still waiting for us to get our act together. Hartwell's voice took on a tone of barely contained pride as he described the third option, or we could execute a precision operation with the resources we had available, relying on superior training, tactical expertise, and the kind of leadership that could hold a unit together when everything went wrong. Which, as you can probably guess, is exactly what we did. The general stood up from his chair, apparently feeling that the climax of his story required a more commanding physical presence. I made the decision to personally lead a strike team into that compound. Not because I was trying to be a hero, but because I understood that when you're asking your people to take extraordinary risks, leadership means being willing to share those risks with them. Several officers exchanged subtle glances. While leading from the front was certainly an admirable leadership trait, the way Hartwell was describing his decision-making process made it sound as though he viewed himself as the only officer in the room capable of making tough choices under pressure. The operation itself was a masterclass in small unit tactics and leadership under fire, the general continued, his voice now carrying the kind of confidence that suggested he had told this story many times before and had perfected every detail for maximum impact. We breached the compound under covering fire, secured the target without civilian casualties, and extracted successfully despite taking enemy fire from multiple positions. Hartwell's chest swelled slightly as he described what he clearly viewed as the defining moment of the operation. The thing that made the difference was leadership. When one of our vehicles took an IED hit during the extraction and we had wounded personnel to evacuate, I made the decision to stay behind with a small team to provide covering fire while the casualties were moved to safety. His voice dropped to a more serious tone, suggesting that he was sharing something particularly meaningful. For 23 minutes, my team held off enemy fire from an estimated 40 to 50 Taliban fighters while the evacuation was completed. 23 minutes that felt like 23 hours, making split-second tactical decisions while under constant fire from multiple directions. The room had grown very quiet, though it was unclear whether the silence reflected respect for the story being told or discomfort with the increasingly grandiose nature of the general's self-description. Morrison, still seated at the far end of the table, continued to listen with the same neutral expression he had maintained throughout the entire presentation. When the smoke cleared and we conducted our after-action review, Hartwell continued, my commanding officer called it one of the most successful operations of the entire deployment. The Taliban commander we captured provided intelligence that led to the disruption of an entire enemy network. Lives were saved because we were willing to take calculated risks and execute a mission that others might have considered too dangerous. The general finally returned to his seat, though his posture remained commanding and his expression suggested that he viewed his story as having successfully proved whatever point he had been trying to make about combat leadership. "That's what I mean when I talk about real leadership under fire," he said, his voice carrying a note of finality that suggested he was summarizing the lesson he expected everyone to draw from his narrative. "It's not something you can learn from a textbook or develop in peacetime training exercises. It's forged in moments when failure means people die, when there are no perfect options, and when leadership means having the courage to make decisions that others are afraid to make." Hartwell's eyes swept around the table, and his expression suggested that he believed his story had definitively established his credentials as a combat leader while simultaneously highlighting the lack of similar experiences among his colleagues. "The problem I see too often in today's military," he continued, apparently not quite finished with his presentation, "is that we're promoting people based on their ability to manage peacetime operations, handle administrative responsibilities, or navigate political situations. Those skills have their place, certainly, but they don't necessarily translate into the kind of leadership that's required when lives are on the line." His tone became more pointed, and his words seemed directed at some of the specific individuals around the table. "Combat leadership requires a different set of skills entirely. It requires the ability to make life-and-death decisions under pressure, to inspire confidence in your people when the odds are against you, and to take personal responsibility for outcomes that determine whether missions succeed or fail." Admiral Chen shifted slightly in her seat, beginning to understand that the general's comments were moving beyond general observations about military leadership and were starting to sound like personal criticisms of officers whose primary experience lay in areas other than ground combat operations. "I'm not suggesting that everyone needs to have led raids or called in artillery strikes," Hartwell said, though his tone suggested otherwise, "but there's something to be said for leaders who have proven themselves in actual combat situations. When you've been responsible for bringing troops home alive from enemy territory, when you've had to make tactical decisions while taking fire, when you've earned the Purple Heart and the Silver Star through actual combat action rather than through administrative achievements, well, that changes your perspective on what leadership really means." The general's hand moved unconsciously to touch the Purple Heart ribbon on his uniform, a gesture that seemed designed to remind everyone present that he had not only led others into combat but had been wounded in the process. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, and it served to underscore his point about the difference between theoretical leadership knowledge and leadership tested under fire. "The truth is," Hartwell continued, his voice taking on an even more confident tone, "when the shooting starts and people's lives hang in the balance, theoretical knowledge about leadership principles becomes less important than the kind of proven ability to perform under pressure that can only come from actual combat experience." His words hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon, creating a tension in the room that hadn't existed at the beginning of the meeting. What had started as a discussion about general leadership challenges had somehow transformed into what felt suspiciously like a lecture about the superiority of combat veterans over other military professionals. Colonel Rodriguez found himself thinking about the many excellent leaders he had known over the years who had served with distinction in roles that didn't involve direct combat but who had nonetheless demonstrated exceptional leadership in their respective areas of expertise. The general's comments seemed to dismiss the contributions of logistics officers, intelligence professionals, medical personnel, and others whose service was essential to military success but didn't fit his narrow definition of combat leadership. Morrison continued to listen without comment, his expression remaining neutral despite the increasingly problematic direction of Hartwell's presentation. As someone who had actually served in the kinds of combat situations the general was describing, Morrison understood better than most the difference between genuine leadership under fire and the kind of self-aggrandizing storytelling that was currently dominating the conversation. But General Hartwell was clearly not finished with his discourse on personal heroism and combat leadership. If anything, the confidence in his voice suggested that he was building toward an even more dramatic conclusion to his impromptu lecture on military leadership and personal achievement. "The bottom line," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no disagreement, "is that real military leadership is tested and proven in combat situations. Everything else is just preparation for that test. And, while I respect the contributions that all military professionals make to our overall mission, when it comes to making the kinds of decisions that determine whether people live or die, there's no substitute for proven combat leadership experience." With these words, General Hartwell seemed to believe that he had successfully established not only his own credentials as a combat leader but also his position in what he clearly viewed as a hierarchy of military leadership based on combat experience. His expression suggested complete confidence in the righteousness of his position and the wisdom of his observations. What he couldn't have anticipated was that his words had been carefully heard and evaluated by someone in the room whose own combat experience and leadership credentials far exceeded anything the general had described, but who had never felt the need to use those experiences as material for public self-congratulation. And that person was about to respond in a way that would completely change the dynamic of the conversation and provide a lesson in humility that would be remembered long after the meeting had ended. The silence that followed General Hartwell's final pronouncement was different from the polite quiet that had characterized the earlier portions of his presentation. This was the kind of silence that fills a room when someone has said something that crosses a line, when words have created a tension that demands some form of response, when the dynamics of a conversation have shifted in a way that cannot simply be ignored or politely overlooked. Admiral Chen glanced around the table, wondering if anyone would address what had become an increasingly uncomfortable situation. Colonel Rodriguez studied his notes, though his expression suggested that he was more concerned with the implications of Hartwell's comments than with whatever was written on his papers. Other officers maintained carefully neutral expressions, the kind of diplomatic faces that military professionals learn to wear when navigating politically sensitive situations. But it was Colonel Morrison who broke the silence. He didn't stand up, didn't raise his voice, and didn't make any of the dramatic gestures that had characterized the general's presentation. Instead, he simply shifted slightly in his chair, cleared his throat almost imperceptibly, and spoke in the same calm, measured tone that had characterized every conversation anyone in the room had ever had with him. "General Hartwell," Morrison said, his voice carrying across the room with quiet authority, "that's an interesting perspective on combat leadership." The words were simple, almost casual, but something in Morrison's tone caused every conversation in the room to stop completely. Hartwell, who had been basking in what he apparently believed was the successful conclusion of his presentation, turned his attention toward the colonel with an expression of mild curiosity mixed with the kind of confidence that suggested he welcomed any opportunity for further discussion of his insights. "I appreciate you sharing your experiences," Morrison continued, his tone remaining perfectly level and professional. "Combat leadership is certainly an important topic, and personal experience in that area obviously provides valuable perspective." General Hartwell nodded slightly, apparently taking Morrison's words as validation of his presentation. "Thank you, Colonel. I believe that those of us who have been tested in actual combat situations have a responsibility to share what we've learned with the broader military community." Morrison paused for a moment, his expression thoughtful, as though he were carefully considering how to phrase his response. Around the table, other officers sensed that something significant was about to happen, though they couldn't have predicted exactly what form it would take. "That's certainly true," Morrison said finally. "Combat experience does provide important insights into leadership under pressure." He paused again, and, when he continued, his voice carried a subtle note that suggested he was moving toward a different kind of observation. "I was thinking, as I listened to your story about Afghanistan, about some of the different ways that military service can test leadership abilities. You're absolutely right that combat situations create unique challenges that can't be fully replicated in peacetime training." Hartwell's expression suggested that he was pleased to have found what appeared to be a supportive voice for his perspectives. "Exactly, Colonel. There's simply no substitute for having your leadership abilities tested under actual fire." Morrison nodded slowly. "I agree completely. Though I suppose different people might define combat in different ways, depending on their particular experiences and the nature of the conflicts they've been involved in." Something in Morrison's tone caused Admiral Chen to look at him more carefully. She had known the colonel for several years, had worked with him on various joint operations, and she recognized something in his manner that suggested he was building toward a point that might not be immediately obvious but would eventually prove significant. "The thing about military service," Morrison continued, his voice remaining calm and conversational, "is that it exposes people to such a wide variety of experiences and challenges. Some officers serve in roles that involve direct combat with enemy forces, others serve in positions that require different kinds of courage and leadership." General Hartwell nodded, though his expression suggested a slight uncertainty about where Morrison's comments might be heading. "That's true, though I think we can agree that actual combat leadership, leading troops under fire, making tactical decisions while being shot at represents a unique form of military service. Morrison's expression remained neutral, but those who knew him well might have detected the slightest change in his posture, a barely perceptible shift that suggested he was transitioning from polite listener to active participant in the conversation. "Oh, absolutely," Morrison said. "Direct combat experience certainly provides unique insights into leadership under pressure. I was just thinking about how different conflicts and different types of operations can create their own particular challenges." He paused, and, when he continued, his tone remained casual but carried a subtle undercurrent that suggested he was drawing from his own extensive experience. "For instance, I remember some operations where the leadership challenges had less to do with enemy fire and more to do with political complexity, cultural sensitivity, and the kind of strategic thinking that determines whether entire missions succeed or fail." Colonel Rodriguez found himself paying closer attention to Morrison's words. Something in the way the colonel was speaking suggested that his seemingly general observations about military service might be grounded in more specific and extensive experience than his modest demeanor typically revealed. "Take counterinsurgency operations, for example," Morrison continued, his voice maintaining the same measured pace. "Those often require a different kind of leadership than conventional combat situations. You're dealing with civilian populations, complex political dynamics, cultural considerations that can make or break an entire operation." General Hartwell's expression had begun to shift slightly. He was clearly still confident in his position, but something in Morrison's manner was beginning to suggest that this conversation might not proceed exactly as he had expected. "That's certainly true," Hartwell said, though his tone carried a slight edge that suggested he was beginning to sense some form of challenge to his narrative. "Though I would argue that those kinds of operations still require the same basic combat leadership skills, the ability to make life and death decisions under pressure, to inspire confidence in your troops, to execute missions successfully despite enemy opposition." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "No disagreement there. Though sometimes the pressure comes from different sources. I've been in situations where the wrong decision could destabilize an entire region, where a single miscalculation could undermine years of diplomatic progress, where the leadership challenge was figuring out how to achieve strategic objectives while navigating incredibly complex political and cultural landscapes." The room had grown very quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. Instead of the uncomfortable tension that had characterized the end of Hartwell's presentation, there was now a sense of anticipation, as though everyone present recognized that they were witnessing something significant but weren't yet sure what it was. "I suppose," Morrison continued, his tone remaining conversational despite the growing attention focused on his words, "that different types of military service create different opportunities to demonstrate leadership under pressure. Some officers prove themselves leading conventional units against enemy forces, others show their abilities in special operations, counterterrorism, humanitarian missions, peacekeeping operations." Admiral Chen found herself thinking about Morrison's personnel file, which she had reviewed when considering him for a joint task force assignment several years earlier. She remembered being impressed by the breadth of his experience, though the classified nature of many of his assignments had made it difficult to fully appreciate the scope of his service record. "The thing about special operations," Morrison said, and something in his tone suggested that he was no longer speaking in general terms but was drawing from personal experience, "is that they often require leadership in situations where conventional military doctrine doesn't really apply. You might be operating with very small teams, in politically sensitive environments, where the margin for error is essentially zero and the consequences of failure extend far beyond the immediate tactical situation." General Hartwell's expression had definitely changed now. He was still maintaining his confident demeanor, but there was something in Morrison's manner that was beginning to suggest that the colonel's quiet contributions to the conversation might be grounded in more than theoretical knowledge about military operations. "I've found," Morrison continued, his voice carrying the same calm authority that characterized everything about his professional presence, "that some of the most challenging leadership situations occur when you're operating without backup, without the normal command structure, without the kinds of support systems that conventional military operations can rely upon." He paused, and, when he continued, his words carried a weight that suggested they were drawn from hard-earned personal experience. "When you're responsible for missions that can't be acknowledged publicly, where success means no one ever knows what you accomplished, where failure could have strategic implications for national security, well, Those situations tend to test leadership abilities in ways that are difficult to describe to people who haven't experienced them directly. The room was now completely silent, with every officer present focused entirely on Morrison's words. Even General Hartwell had stopped interrupting, apparently recognizing that he was hearing something that deserved his complete attention. "The challenge in those kinds of operations," Morrison said, his tone remaining calm but carrying an undertone of absolute authority, "is that you often have to make decisions without complete information, coordinate with foreign military and intelligence services, navigate political situations that could destabilize entire regions, and accomplish strategic objectives while maintaining plausible deniability for your own government." Morrison's expression remained neutral, but his words were painting a picture of military service that extended far beyond the conventional combat operations that had dominated General Hartwell's presentation. Without making any direct claims about his own experience, he was describing a level of operational complexity and strategic responsibility that dwarfed anything the general had mentioned. "I suppose what I'm getting at," Morrison said, his voice carrying a note of gentle conclusion, "is that military service exposes officers to such a wide variety of leadership challenges that it's sometimes difficult to rank them in order of importance or difficulty. Combat leadership is certainly crucial, but so is strategic thinking, cultural sensitivity, political awareness, and the ability to operate effectively in ambiguous situations where the rules aren't clearly defined." As he finished speaking, Morrison's eyes met General Hartwell's across the table, and something in that brief moment of eye contact suggested that the conversation was about to take yet another turn, one that would finally provide the context that would give full meaning to everything the colonel had just said. General Hartwell opened his mouth to respond to what he apparently still believed was a theoretical discussion about different types of military service, but Colonel Morrison continued speaking before he could interject. And, when Morrison spoke again, his tone remained exactly the same, calm, measured, professional, but his words carried a weight that would fundamentally change everyone's understanding of the conversation that had just taken place. "For example," Morrison said, his voice carrying no more emphasis than if he were discussing the weather, "I spent 3 years running classified operations in Bosnia during the worst of the ethnic cleansing campaigns. The leadership challenge there wasn't tactical combat in the conventional sense, but rather coordinating with NATO forces, UN peacekeepers, and local military units to identify mass graves, gather evidence of war crimes, and protect civilian populations while maintaining strict neutrality in an incredibly complex political situation." The room became so quiet that the gentle hum of the air conditioning system seemed almost loud by comparison. General Hartwell's expression had shifted from confidence to careful attention, as though he was beginning to understand that Colonel Morrison's seemingly general observations about military service might have been grounded in rather more specific experience than he had initially realized. Morrison continued in the same conversational tone, as though he were simply providing additional examples to illustrate his previous points. "After that, I spent 2 years in Somalia coordinating humanitarian operations while working with tribal leaders who were actively engaged in civil war. The challenge there was figuring out how to deliver aid to civilian populations while navigating between warlords who viewed our presence as either an opportunity or a threat, depending on their immediate tactical needs." Admiral Chen found herself reconsidering everything she thought she knew about Morrison's career. She had always known he was highly regarded and had extensive operational experience, but his quiet demeanor had never suggested the scope of what he had apparently accomplished during his 4 decades of service. "The thing about those operations," Morrison said, maintaining his matter-of-fact tone, "is that they require a different kind of decision-making than conventional military situations. You're often working with incomplete intelligence, coordinating with foreign governments and international organizations, trying to accomplish strategic objectives while maintaining relationships with local leaders who may have their own agendas." Morrison paused briefly, and, when he continued, his words carried the unmistakable weight of personal experience. "I remember one particular situation in Somalia where we had to evacuate an entire refugee camp because of intelligence indicating an imminent attack by one of the local militias. The operation required coordination between U.S. forces, UN peacekeepers, and tribal leaders who were technically neutral but who had family members on different sides of the conflict." General Hartwell was now listening with complete attention, his earlier confidence replaced by what appeared to be genuine interest in learning more about operations that were clearly outside his own area of experience. "We had maybe 4 hours to move 12,000 people to safety," Morrison continued, his voice carrying the same calm authority that suggested he was drawing from memories rather than imagination. The leadership challenge wasn't about tactical combat, though there was certainly potential for contact with hostile forces, but about organizing a massive humanitarian operation under time pressure while working through translators with tribal leaders who had their own concerns about the political implications of cooperating with American forces. Morrison's expression remained neutral, but something in his manner suggested that he was sharing information that he had never felt the need to discuss publicly before. The operation was successful, but it required the kind of split-second decision-making that you mentioned earlier, General, combined with cultural sensitivity, diplomatic skills, and strategic thinking about the broader implications of our actions for U.S. policy in the region. Colonel Rodriguez found himself completely absorbed in Morrison's account. The colonel's description of complex humanitarian operations under combat conditions was providing a perspective on military leadership that extended far beyond anything that had been discussed earlier in the meeting. After Somalia, Morrison continued, still speaking in the same conversational tone, I was assigned to a joint task force that worked with Russian military units in Chechnya to locate and secure nuclear materials that had been stolen from former Soviet facilities. That assignment lasted 18 months and required coordination with Russian Spetsnaz units, CIA operatives, and local Chechen leaders who were sometimes fighting each other while simultaneously cooperating with us to prevent nuclear materials from falling into the hands of international terrorist organizations. The implications of what Morrison was describing were beginning to sink in around the table. These weren't the kinds of operations that appeared in official military histories or got discussed in public forums. They were the kinds of classified missions that most military officers never even heard about, much less participated in directly. The leadership challenges in that environment, Morrison said, his tone remaining unchanged despite the extraordinary nature of what he was describing, included all the conventional military skills, tactical planning, risk assessment, coordination under fire, but also required language abilities, cultural knowledge, and the kind of strategic thinking that considers the potential implications of every decision for U.S.-Russian relations and regional stability. General Hartwell's expression had shifted completely. The confident authority that had characterized his earlier presentation had been replaced by what appeared to be genuine respect for Morrison's obvious expertise and experience in areas of military operations that extended far beyond conventional combat leadership. Morrison continued his matter-of-fact recounting. Most recently, I spent 4 years coordinating counter-terrorism operations in Afghanistan and Pakistan that required working with local military and intelligence services while maintaining operational security for missions that couldn't be acknowledged publicly by either government. He paused, and, for the first time since he had begun speaking, there was a slight change in his tone, not dramatic, but enough to suggest that he was moving toward a conclusion. Those operations involved everything from direct action missions against high-value targets to complex psychological operations designed to undermine terrorist recruiting networks. The leadership challenge was figuring out how to accomplish strategic objectives while working through foreign intelligence services, maintaining plausible deniability, and ensuring that tactical successes didn't create strategic problems. Morrison's eyes met General Hartwell's across the table, and, when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of gentle finality. I suppose what I learned from those experiences is that military leadership takes many different forms, depending on the nature of the mission and the strategic context in which operations are conducted. Combat leadership is certainly important, but so is the ability to work effectively with foreign military and intelligence services, to understand the political implications of tactical decisions, and to accomplish objectives that serve broader strategic purposes. The colonel's words hung in the air like smoke from an artillery barrage, creating a silence that felt fundamentally different from anything that had characterized the meeting up to that point. This wasn't the uncomfortable tension that had followed Hartwell's lengthy self-promotion, nor was it the anticipatory quiet that had preceded Morrison's response. This was the silence that follows a revelation, the moment when everyone present recognizes that they have witnessed something significant and are trying to process its full implications. General Hartwell cleared his throat, and, when he spoke, his voice carried none of the bombastic confidence that had characterized his earlier presentation. Colonel Morrison, I had no idea about the scope of your operational experience. Those are exactly the kinds of complex leadership challenges that don't get discussed often enough in military leadership development programs. Morrison nodded slightly, his expression remaining unchanged. Thank you, General. I've been fortunate to serve in roles that provided opportunities to work on a variety of different types of operations over the years. The understatement was so profound that it would have been humorous if the context had been different. What Morrison had just described wasn't a variety of different types of operations, it was a career spanning some of the most sensitive and strategically important military missions of the past 4 decades, the kinds of operations that shaped international relations and national security policy at the highest levels of government. But, perhaps most remarkably, Morrison's tone throughout his entire presentation had remained exactly the same as it had been when he first spoke: calm, professional, and completely devoid of the self-aggrandizement that had characterized Hartwell's earlier narrative. He had described decades of extraordinary service and leadership in some of the most challenging operational environments in the world, but he had done so in the same matter-of-fact tone he might have used to discuss routine administrative matters. Admiral Chen found herself thinking about the profound difference between Morrison's approach to discussing his service record and the theatrical presentation that had dominated the earlier part of the meeting. Morrison had demonstrated through his quiet competence exactly the kind of leadership philosophy he had been describing: leadership that focused on accomplishment rather than recognition, on service rather than glory, on results rather than self-promotion. The meeting eventually continued with its original agenda, but the dynamic in the room had been permanently altered. General Hartwell participated in the remaining discussions, but his contributions were notably more measured and thoughtful than his earlier performance had suggested they would be. Other officers found themselves reassessing their own understanding of military leadership and the various forms it could take. But, perhaps most importantly, everyone present had witnessed a masterclass in the kind of quiet leadership that Morrison had spent his career exemplifying. He had responded to grandiosity with humility, to self-promotion with facts, to bombast with quiet dignity. He had demonstrated that true leadership speaks through action rather than words, through accomplishment rather than claims, through service rather than self-aggrandizement. When the meeting finally concluded several hours later, officers filed out of the conference room with a different understanding of leadership than they had possessed when they arrived. They had seen two very different approaches to military service and professional achievement, and the contrast had been instructive in ways that no formal leadership development program could have replicated. General Hartwell approached Morrison as the room was emptying and extended his hand. "Colonel, I want to thank you for sharing your perspective on military leadership. I clearly have a lot to learn from officers with your breadth of experience." Morrison shook the general's hand and responded with the same quiet dignity that had characterized everything about his participation in the morning's discussions. "Thank you, General. I think we all continue learning from each other's experiences throughout our careers. That's one of the great privileges of military service, the opportunity to work with so many exceptional people who bring different perspectives and expertise to our common mission." As the two officers parted ways, each carried with them a different lesson from the morning's events. General Hartwell had learned something about the value of humility and the power of quiet competence. Colonel Morrison had simply continued demonstrating the same leadership philosophy that had guided his service for 4 decades, that the measure of a military officer is not found in the stories they tell about themselves, but in the trust they earn, the missions they accomplish, and the quiet dignity with which they serve their country and their fellow service members. The story of that morning would be retold many times in the years that followed, but always with a focus on the profound lesson about leadership that had emerged from the contrast between bombast and quiet competence, between self-promotion and genuine achievement, between the need for recognition and the satisfaction of service well performed. It became a reminder that in military service, as in life, the most powerful responses often come not from those who speak the loudest, but from those who have earned the right to speak softly and still command absolute respect and attention.